Thank you everyone for joining this session. I'll open with this side note. This was supposed to be a joint talk, a co-talk, but my colleague Rakesh couldn't make it, so it's down to me to do everything. Unfortunately, was supposed to, I would say, focus more on the technical side of the tooling part, as he's the lead developer of the tool. So for that particular reason, we've prepared to showcase videos almost at the end of the talk, so you'll be able to see the functionality of the tooling sort of live, although it's recorded. And all of that is also published on GitHub repository for the open source project itself. So starting, SEPIA was this interesting idea, this interesting topic that we had for the past several years now. Although it was initially conceptualized before I joined Bosch. So quick introduction, I'm Nikola. I work for Bosch Digital. I'm an open source consultant and a member of the OSPO. What we do there with this particular idea and with this particular project is we'll go through a bit of a history lesson, basically our individual use case, our individual way of how we conceptualize this idea, and basically where we are headed, what are our goals for this project, and the overall roadmap in a way. So starting on, okay, so I should stick around. We outlined generally three problems. These three problems is what is the backbone of this idea. So the first one being the problems, the second and the third ones are the external requirements and the standardized SBOMs. And this is basically what, as I said, was the backbone for this idea, how we reached the point to say, okay, we need to have a standardized approach across the company to have an idea and a process to handle SBOMs. And that was at a time that most of the stuff didn't exist, or it didn't exist to the level that it is now, because this is an ever-growing, I would say, an issue and a problem. And with that, for us, it took a bit of time to get everything together and to have this thing done. So we'll break down the individual problems. As I said, we'll go through a bit of a history lesson of how what was the ideation process behind the SEPIA open source project and the tooling itself, and the overall idea for it. So starting with the formats, Bosch in general being this open chain conformant company, we'll regularly do conformance checks, whether this would be for individual units and entities or across the group in general, to ensure our conformance with the ISO. And when the time comes to look more deeper into the SBOM topic, we looked specifically into that particular section of the ISO. And this is what it says, that a process shall exist for creating and managing SBOMs, and that's generally it. So at the time, for us, having so many different units and so many differently generated SBOMs, different formats, different data in each individual SBOM, for us, the dead bomb scenario was quite valid. So not having a structure and a blueprint to build a process behind it, for us it was hard to do. So this was, I would say, the first hurdle that we had to sort of overcome. And then, at the time, not as, I would say, the SBOM guide by the telco work group, recently updated, as far as I saw, in May. But at the time, it was, again, still a conceptual idea a few years ago. And now, I could say it's probably one of the best baselines that you can have to build your SBOM generation process, SBOM handling, and whatnot. So at the time, we were looking from a perspective, okay, this comes from a telco industry, so it's based on the NTIA requirements, so it's more or less catered to that particular industry. But we have arose in so many different industries, so this is not applicable to us. And with that, we had to figure out a way to do better at the time, or at least to figure out how to do better. And the third aspect of the formats is probably something that everyone knows in this room, but the two, I would say, most common machine processable standards or formats, because SPDX is actually a standard, as far as I know. CycloneDX isn't yet. We had this scenario that for us at the time, as I mentioned, we have different units and different teams that will generate whatever SBOM they'll do with whatever information they'll just put in a way. Then you don't have a way to validate it. You don't have a way to have this particular statement regarding what's in it and how truthful it is. And also the drawback of the two individual, I do consider it at the time that it was a drawback because each individual format would has each individual focus. One being license compliance, the other more catering to security vulnerabilities, I would say. And then we will move to the external requirements. The external requirements was the second problem for us. And this is something that I've already briefly mentioned, but this more or less focuses on the actual relationship that we'll have with customers, whether those or vendors, whether that would be third-party vendors that would produce a component that would be used by a team that will be integrated into a product that will be later shipped. And again, at the time, you could see SBOMs in Word format, you can see SBOMs in Excel, embedded Excel, different formats. One will come in SPDX 2.2, one will come in 2.1, one will be in CycloneDX, and it will be, sorry to put it like that, but a complete mess to handle. And for us at the time, this was, I would say, the main concern, because having a heterogeneous environment with so many teams around the world that you typically, even internally, you would ship components in a way. We have our own compliance process for that, but to able to integrate handling of SBOMs on top of that, it was, again, the next hurdle. And the next logical, I would say, hurdle, if you can put it like that, was the authorities. Because actually the regulatory bodies and other stakeholders in the overall process is, everyone knows about the CRA and the ever more pressing issue or concern for companies. When it will come in full effect, the preparation and whatnot. In the past few days, this was, again, one of the main topics that we had with people for companies that don't even, or SMEs or whatever, they don't know to what extent that would affect them. And the time is passing by, and the time will come to face some consequences for some. And we wanted to be proactive, not to be reactive. So by the list of the different authorities and the different guidelines that we sort of gathered together, again, we definitely use BIS and NSA's requirements that are revolving or related towards export controls, whether that would be cryptography or any categorization for cataloging all the components related to open source, whether that would be the technical guideline for the BSI, the German Federal Bureau of Information Security, and specifically the second part of that guideline that is specifically related to SBOM, that typically outlines I would say, the recommended set of requirements or data that you need to have in an SBOM. And I think now this is probably also the other guideline that you can use to build a comprehensive SBOM. Outlining again the NTIA, whether that, as I said earlier, whether that is specifically catered and focused towards the telco industry, it's still something to keep in mind, because I would say probably we'll reach a point in time that we won't have like a one standardized SBOM for everyone, but at least we'll have like a minimum data set or a minimum data values that you need to have in an SBOM across the industry. And then you have your different flavors for the different industry. And the third problem that we outlined so far was the standardized SBOMs. This is something that I mentioned earlier. For us, it was comparing apples to bananas, especially, as I said, the different focus of the two different standards. And with that, it came that, as I said, different teams would use different things. Different teams will produce different things, different SBOMs. And at the end of the day, for us, at least initially, it was more important to have an SBOM and the team to feel knowledgeable enough or to understand why they need to do this than just forcing them to use one or the other. In most aspects, the typical use case would be that the team would use the preferable format that is more applicable to their context of whatever the context of the product is. So in a way, this was our way of handling that to make people more and more ease into that whole particular framework. And comparing the two standards or the two formats, for us at the time it was visible again something that I mentioned is the different versions. You cannot really guarantee or ensure compatibility between like backwards and forwards compatibility between the different versions, and with that we had to get this resolved, at least on internal level. The other thing with this was the complexity of the software architecture, and for us initially trying to focus on basically building an SBOM that specifically identifies itself with the or reflects how the software architecture and dependencies are done. So in particularly to the context of the team, that was really time consuming and it's rather difficult to do. So for us it was again giving them some freedom to do what they feel comfortable with, as long as they produce a document that we are comfortable with. And we sort of also wanted to avoid this hassle of going through every time for every release to do like a conversion, merging, a mapping, modifying, all of this thing. Because at the end, when you go through that loophole, in some or in most cases, we had evidence that compliance data will get lost or it will get altered in a way that it's no longer relevant. So the second portion of this was again the mapping. In mapping and using the two different formats, for us it was this particular option and this particular handling of mapping the different SBOMs into the two different standards with amplifying their main focus. And although they do have a lot of common attributes, as we've outlined, these attributes indeed are not that common. And the merging itself is, like I mentioned, this is something that we do on a daily basis, even still, due to the complexity of the setup of the different teams in many instances. However, it's a difficult type of process. In many cases, you'll get duplicated entries, and someone will have to review the duplicated entries. Someone will have to manually curate the merged SBOM. And until then, if there was an automatic tool that you can use for merging, mapping, editing, whatever, to us that felt like, okay, this is pretty much gambling with compliance. So if you just rely on hitting a button and it merges your SBOM and you leave it as it is, then and you are really you're really trusting the end result, then you're not doing a pretty good job, compliance-wise. Here, we wanted to outline the bigger picture, or how we say it, what the typical workflow of our day-to-day stuff would be, and how we would typically use the validator in our process. So in the middle, you see the SEPIA validator. So the first three features, functions, whatever you want to use as a term, are what is currently available. And we'll talk about this later. The highlighted ones are basically on the roadmap. But on the left side, you will see what we will typically do. So we will either use an SBOM that's generated by an SCA tool that we've adopted. For example, that could be ORT, or any other SCA tool that would generate an SBOM to dependency analysis and whatnot. And when we have an SBOM, we'll feed it in and validate against a defined schema. The other typical use case for us is, as I mentioned earlier, an SBOM that's generated or provided by a third-party vendor, typically for a component that we get from them, and we integrate into our product and then deliver, whether internally or externally. So the whole point of this is you can take generally any SBOM in a certain format, you can feed it into the tool and validate against a schema that you've chosen. So again, you can have your library of schemas regardless of the format. So you have a drop-down in the UI that we'll demonstrate a bit later. You have the option to pick up what the schema would be that you validate against. Then you upload your SBOM that you want to validate, and you actually click one button and you're produced with a result. And it will show whether it's valid or invalid. If it's valid, okay, congrats. If it's invalid, then you have some stuff to do. The invalid SBOM could directly be edited within the tool. You'll be prompted with the different errors that the tool matched based on the schema that you are using to validate against. And basically, you can edit out the errors that you get. And once you do, you revalidate, you get a valid result. What you also can do is you can merge it. With the merge functionality, typically you can do a merging of at least two SBOMs. The only catch is they have to be valid. So you go typically from a validation process, you validate an SBOM, you can store it in your internal database. That's typically the case with us. And then later on, when you need to do the merging, you take it from there, you feed it in, then you feed another one, and you merge them together. And as I said, unfortunately, you will be produced with duplicated results that you have to verify on your own. You have to curate the findings. But that's still part of the whole deal with merging SBOMs. And as I discussed this with Rakesh last week, was the last time that we had this conversation, is he said something interesting that is like, probably there won't be a time that you won't be producing duplicated results, because the whole point of that is to basically map out that particular component, where it is, where it's coming from. So if you just delete it from the end SBOM, you're sort of deleting that, what's the origin of that component in a way. So their understanding for the time being is that producing duplicated results will still exist. Sorry. And the other typical scenario that we have is we'll have a validated SBOM, we'll provide it to a supplier or an OEM or basically an external party or external stakeholder, whatever you want to call him. And there are instances that they say, okay, we need some more information in that SBOM. They'll send it back. We'll feed it in. We'll add the additional information that they need. And then again, we'll revalidate and store it or directly send it to them. So the next part is going through, again, a bit of the roadmap of what we currently have. As I said, the current features that we developed so far are the validation, the editing, and the merging functionalities. They're currently applicable both for SPDX and CycloneDX in the various different versions of the formats. And as I said, you can add your SBOM schema that you want to use as validation blueprint, basically, and add this to your custom database of schemas that you want to use. On the right, you'll just see some generic SBOM schema. It's not really the schema that we defined and published on the GitHub repository. So we have a CycloneDX and an SPDX schemas that we defined and published there based on our use cases and what we sort of evaluated and mapped as semantic relevant data that we need in an SBOM up until now. Or up until a few months ago, they're now in the process of updating them based on the most recent data that we have. The in development part has this asterisk on it because to some degree we've put on basically the development on hold until probably the end of the year. And this is why, because we had these discussions with Rakesh and the actual team lead of the whole project, that we need to align with the community. We need to make sure that we are not doing something or we're not investing effort in something that it's not viable for the community, and wanted to basically use that opportunity to get feedback, exchange knowledge, exchange data in a way of what is really missing or what is the more pressing concern, what is the priority feature that has to be developed next. We do typically agree that the conversion is the next logical thing, because as I said, for us specifically internally, that is probably one of the most important features that we want to have. Because as I said, we have pretty heterogeneous environment, and that goes in line with having to convert from SPDX to CycloneDX and vice versa. Whether we go truly in that route, through that route, or we focus on something else, I guess we'll have discussions. We are all usually in the most common SBOM work groups, whether that would be the Open Chain SBOM study group. In the past, I used to join the telco work group from time to time, but now it's in conflict with other activities. So at least I try to join the Open Chain SBOM study group, and this is where this was presented. But at the time, the tooling itself wasn't open sourced. So some of you might have seen here and there glimpses of that. And going into the topic of why we are doing this is the benefits that we see in this is for us to ensure some semantic relevance to the machine processable SBOM exchange, providing a validator that typically does what most of the validators does, but also a bit more, and to reach some common ground. As I said, usually our understanding of this is this has to be a community effort in a way, because you cannot expect to be I would say the sole actor in that process, because you cannot take anything into consideration. And for us, this also helps the process of ensuring that when we work with external vendors, they also have a tool, for example, to use to validate our requirements, basically. So when they produce an SBOM and deliver it to us, we sort of avoid the effort into revalidating what they provide. And we tested it, and it went on. So let's see, because I tested in everything else, but I had some technical issues. So let's see.
Now let's look at an example of validating an SPDX 2.3 SBOM. So currently, I've chosen SPDX 2.3 schema type, which has its own optional and mandatory parameters. Now I'm uploading a valid SPDX 2.3 file and I'm clicking on validate. Now I get the status valid. Now let's try it with an invalid SPDX 2.3 SBOM and see like what are the errors that we are getting. So now I get the status as invalid, and when I have to look into it further, I click on this invalid button, and now I see in the packages section there is an error which says it contains invalid items. And when I expand the tree further, I could see like there are some values that are missing. And once I choose a value, then the error is gone. Like this, we have a lot of errors that we can debug, and that's how we can fix this and generate an SBOM. Thank you.
So, as I said earlier, this is basically showing you how to typically validate and then edit out the errors that you get. And as you can see, it's typically pretty straightforward, especially for someone who has basic knowledge about this. I think that you won't have trouble. As I also mentioned, the code base is already open source, so you can pretty much go there and get it and test it out. You have the QR code at the end to be able to actually get to the project. But although if you write in simply in Google SEPIA validator GitHub, that will be probably the top result.
Hi. Now let's see an example of merging two SBOMs. For this purpose, we are choosing two SBOMs from SPDX 2.3. So I uploaded two SBOMs that are valid, and please note that if your SBOM is invalid, then it's not possible to merge. And once I click on the merge button, it takes me to a page where I have to give the details about the package. Basically, it's like the product information. And in the primary package purpose, we have a lot of options which are defined by SPDX. So I'm just choosing application as an example, and license is something that can be given as a text, and you provide the organization and also the person. And once you submit, you get a SBOM that is merged, and you can just download this. Thank you.
And yeah, that was a showcasing for merging two SBOMs. It doesn't delve that deep into, as I mentioned earlier, the duplicated entries, but that is basically on how you want to handle them. That's down to you, in a way. So the next logical step for us after conceptualizing all this was to make it open source. And to make it open source for us, it wasn't just, okay, let's get it out there and get done with this. For us, one of the main topics why, or one of the main reasons why we try to do this is to basically fight against the ambiguity of the root causes in an SBOM. And this is why we defined our own schemas, whether that's an SPDX or CycloneDX. We've published them in the repo, so you can use them. Or the other main idea behind this, and this is why in the beginning I said it's not typically just the validator, it's more than that. For me, at least, that's the more important part of the project itself. Is we really want to focus on building and curating an SBOM schema library. So that would mean that probably other stakeholders in the industry, they contribute their SBOM schemas, and with that we start building and curating a library. This would help us to not focus on what tool was used or what is the format, but to reach a point that we have a baseline across the industry. And as I said, we are not just providing the tool, but we sort of want to develop it in the open. This is why we wanted to align and sync with the community. What are the next typical logical steps for the ecosystem, where we want to go, what are the focuses should be, what are the next features to be developed, and this to be done in the open. We have a team of a few developers that solely did this from scratch. And as I said, they'll keep doing it in the open. The other thing that we want to do is to provide an evaluation and mapping of basically the semantic definition of the important properties in SPDX and CycloneDX. To some extent, we do this with the defined schemas that we published, but this is an ongoing effort. It's not something that's done and dusted. And probably this will be my sort of last thing to say about this call to action. I've already said it a few times. We want your SBOM schemas. So if you want to contribute, if you want to do anything relevant to help us, or you're interested in getting this further, you think that this is probably the best way to do it, donate donate is an interesting word, but contribute your schemas. Whatever you use, whatever you think that you can get out in the open, so we can build this and curate this library. So as I said, we reach a point that we don't care about what is the format or what is the tool that was used to generate that. So we reach a point that we have a common standardized approach regarding SBOMs. And this is basically the wrap up of we'll continue to do this action. I've already mentioned the Open Chain SBOM study group. This is where we typically meet. And this is where we'll keep presenting the next few steps of what we do with this. So with that, I think I have a few minutes for maybe a few questions. And this is the QR code. So yeah, thank you. This is the QR code that I mentioned. This is how you get to the GitHub repo. And if you want to connect, have some questions, whether it's a whole track or whatever you want to ask later or after the conference, this is how you can get to Rakesh and myself. So time for questions. Okay, I'll start from the closer person. Sorry.
Yes, not really a question, but you quoted my work since I'm the chair of the Open Chain Telco SBOM group, and I will have a presentation of it this afternoon. So you're welcome. Everyone is welcome to join.
I know, but for the others, yeah, I saw.
So you showed that SEPIA can be used in the browser manually, but do you also have interfaces for continuous integration use cases?
Currently not. Unfortunately, the tool itself is like a web app. So it solely relies on manual input. So to have the automation, maybe at some point, our team is involved into, for example, ORT development, or we have colleagues that are like the core maintainers of that tool. We've already started having discussion whether it makes sense to at least do a POC or something to sort of test it out in an automated way.
At Bosch, is that tool somehow used in your processes of license clearance and vulnerability monitoring?
Yes and no. In a way, it's a tricky question because for us we do have like a central directive, for example, that outlines the requirements, but each individual unit typically has a compliance process on top of that, and some compliance processes would include different tools, and this at the moment is typically used by our CUC team. That's the center of competence, center of control regarding how open source is used in general across Bosch. And it's still in its infancy. But how we see it is this probably turns out to be something that's used across internally. As I said, it's still more on the concept side than on typically used to.
So at first, I'm quite happy that you talk about consuming the SBOMs and not just generating them, as many of the other talks, because in my opinion, that is the far bigger problem. So I know the difference between the formats SPDX and CycloneDX. Like in CycloneDX, you cannot have a difference between the binary and the source packages, while in SPDX you can have it. And one problem we see as we as Siemens, we have a lot of Debian systems where we generate SBOMs from, that there you have package URLs which are not upstream packages per se, but which are packages from the distribution. That mean we have patches on top, security fixes are backported, and so on. And by that you have different version specifiers than just what you get from upstream. You also don't have a stable download URL. How does your tool work with these package URLs from the various package managers, where you cannot simply use an CURL call to download something to then consume that in, I don't know, for license clearing or vulnerability checking?
Okay, so it wasn't that evident from the showcase that we did, because yeah, it focuses more on how than the fundamentals behind it. Typically, the validation, as I said, it's based on what you deem viable. So if the SBOM that you feed in doesn't have that data, it will immediately pop up as an error. So basically, you define the data that you need to validate against. And if you think that the schema that you use as a blueprint for validation has to have certain metadata, and then you feed an SBOM that doesn't have that metadata anyway, by default it will have an error. So the tool relies on basically, it's like a sort of two-pronged approach. What you have as a blueprint for validation, and what is your own inputs that you feed in. So it doesn't bridge the gap. You are then manually bridging the gap by editing the result in a way to make sure that it's validated at the end. So I'm not certain whether that answers your question, but you also mentioned something interesting. I don't want to give you a whole from lunch or anything. Typically, what the tool mainly focuses, and that's what we try to avoid, is to move away from focusing on one tool that generates SBOM, because we cannot ensure that every team uses that, because based on their use case, they might not have a capacity to generate an SBOM from, let's say, a certain container image or this and that. So based on their context, they have to use something else. And to move away from that, this is why we are doing this. So hope that answers generally what you meant. Any other questions? Because I think we are basically at it. Okay, thank you.